I keep hoping that somebody's going to start cranking Enter Sandman. I'm Butch Lazarchak. I'm from the Library of Congress, and I want to talk to you about the costs and benefits of preserving digital, historic, and superseded geospatial data. I'm going to mostly talk about the benefits, but you have to talk about the costs to some extent. There are costs and there are benefits. There are lots of benefits to preserving this information. The Library of Congress has partnerships that we're working with a network of state and local governments to explore ways to preserve historic digital data, and we want you to become partners. So there was an older map on here, is what maps used to look like. We all know this is what maps look like right now. And while libraries and archives are used to dealing with analog and paper maps and preserving them over the time, we have a harder time figuring out how to preserve these digital maps. And one problem that we have, I think, is that the word preservation is a dirty word in a certain way. When people hear the word preservation, a lot of times they think about things that don't have value anymore. They're old things that they don't use necessarily. But and when I talk to funders and legislators, I kind of bring up this thought of them thinking about whether digital preservation is a cost center or whether it's a benefit center. And I'm going to try and convince you that it's a benefit center in a lot of different ways. So there are huge benefits to current geospatial data, digital geospatial data. Users have pretty much spoken, and they love this, right? So why are not some of the benefits for current data equally valuable for historic or superseded digital geospatial data? And part of how we're doing this at the Library of Congress is demonstrating this value not just with the cultural heritage use case, which of course is important to us, but by leveraging a lot of other use cases that are important to funders and legislators and the GIS community. So these are things that you guys know a lot about already, but that people in the library and archives community maybe don't think about that much when they're trying to convince people to preserve this historic digital data. One of the, you've got disaster recovery, continuity of operations, and one of the things that I like the most is this idea of enhanced access for things we don't even realize are going to happen in the future, because this enhanced access to this data encourages drives these sort of incentives to preserve the information. So there are these benefits. Accessibility creates use. Use creates demand. Demand creates value. Value creates these benefits. So when we speak to legislators and funders, we say, what are you going to do with all these benefits that are obviously there by making this historic data accessible to your users? And this is something for them to think about. Of course, there are costs. And there are several ways that with the projects that we're working on, thinking about ways to mitigate these costs. The idea that benefits are decentralized, but costs are localized. Somebody has to pay for the servers that this data sits on. Forever or 5 years, it's the idea that when we think about preserving things for the long term, we don't have to think about 100 years. We can think about 5-year increments, because preservation is really this series of handoffs, technological, social. Every 5 years or so, there's a new technological regime. And we just have to move through those 5-year increments. So digital really is more fragile than analog materials. And in the library and archives community, we figured out pretty much how to preserve the analog materials, but digital is much more complex because of the variety of different reasons that digital information is so useful but also complex. So some of the things we've been working with in a project that is involving 3 states, Utah, Kentucky, and North Carolina, are some of the issues involved in preserving digital geospatial data, such as format issues and the idea of keeping these information systems alive over time. But somebody does have to think about the long term, not just the 5-year increment, but the long term, beyond the 5-year, 10-year increment. And somebody has to be thinking about the future, unlike these guys, who didn't think much about the SRI happy hour. And these entities are pretty much libraries and archives. We have this position where we think about things over the long term. And a lot of times people think of libraries and archives as just places where old things reside. But in fact, libraries and archives are collecting things today for some unforeseen user 100 years down the road in the future. So in some ways, we're thinking about the future as much as anybody might be. So the program I work in is the National Digital Information Infrastructure and Preservation Program at the library. And as I said, we're funding a series of projects that are exploring ways, working with academia, the private sector, other government agencies, to preserve this historic digital superseded data over time. So what can you do, and why are we here? We're here to meet with anyone who's interested in this, and interested in the data on the historic side, interested in the technology that helps to preserve it, interested in the formats that make it complex to preserve this information over time, and we'd love to talk to you about it. Thanks.